My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 34 years old, and 3 years ago, my own family held a funeral for me while I was still breathing. I wasn't in a casket. I wasn't a body they buried. I was a name they erased, a chair they stopped setting at the table, a son and brother they decided to forget on purpose. And the worst part isn't that they thought I was gone. The worst part is how relieved they looked when they believed it. I want to take you back to the morning everything cracked open, because that's the only place to start. It was a Tuesday in late April. I was standing in the parking lot of a law office in downtown Columbus, Ohio, holding an envelope with my father's handwriting on it, the first letter he'd sent me in 11 years. My hands were shaking so bad I had to lean against my truck just to open it. Inside was a single page, 4 sentences. The kind of sentences that don't just break your heart, they rearrange your whole understanding of who you are. But to understand why that letter detonated my family's perfect little world, you need to know what came before it. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton called Fairborn, in a house with green shutters and a porch swing my mother never let anyone actually swing on because she didn't want the chains to squeak. My father, Russell Holloway, ran a mid-size HVAC company he'd built from nothing. My mother, Diane, taught 3rd grade for almost 20 years. And then there was my younger brother, Tyler, 2 years behind me, golden-haired, easy smiling, the kind of kid who got away with everything because he knew exactly how to cry on command. I was the oldest. I was supposed to be the example. Instead, I became the warning. It started small, the way these things always do. If Tyler broke something, it was an accident. If I broke something, it was carelessness. If Tyler forgot his homework, he was just a kid being a kid. If I forgot mine, I was not living up to my potential. My mother had a way of saying my name, Marcus, that always came out a half step lower than when she said Tyler's, like she was bracing herself before the word even left her mouth. By the time I was 16, I understood the math of my own family. Tyler got the benefit of the doubt. I got the bill. The thing that really set the foundation for everything that happened later came when I was 19. My father needed startup capital to expand the HVAC business into commercial contracts, and my grandfather, his own father, had left a small trust that was supposed to be split evenly between me and Tyler when we turned 25. My father convinced my grandmother, who controlled the trust until then, to let him borrow against my share early, promising he'd pay it back with interest once the business turned a profit. I was 19. I trusted him. I signed where he told me to sign. That $51,000 disappeared into the business and never came back. Tyler's portion of the trust, conveniently, was never touched. Nobody ever explained why. When I brought it up once at 22, my father looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You'll get yours when you earn it the right way, not by complaining about money you never worked for." I didn't argue. I'd already learned arguing in that house was like trying to negotiate with a wall that had decided, long before you walked in, exactly how the conversation would end. The real break came when I was 23. I'd been quietly building something on the side for almost 2 years. A small logistics software tool I'd coded myself to help independent truckers track fuel costs and delivery windows more efficiently. Nothing fancy at first, just something I built because I was frustrated watching guys I knew lose money to bad routing. I never told my family about it, not because I was hiding something shameful, but because I'd learned that anything good I did in that house got reframed as something arrogant, something that needed to be cut down before it grew too tall. That instinct to stay quiet saved me later in ways I couldn't have imagined. The software started gaining traction. A regional trucking company in Indiana picked it up, then a bigger one in Tennessee. By 25, I had incorporated. By 27, I had 4 employees and a contract with a logistics firm that processed work for half the Midwest. I told no one in my family. I lived modestly. I drove the same truck I'd had since high school. I rented a small 2-bedroom outside Dayton and kept my head down, because some part of me, even then, knew I might need a version of myself that nobody in that house could see coming. Then came the night that ended everything. It was Thanksgiving, 23 years old, my mother's dining room, the good china out, my father carving the turkey like he was performing surgery. Tyler had brought his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Brianna who worked at the same bank as my mother's sister. Somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the pumpkin pie, Tyler made an offhand comment about needing to borrow money to cover a gambling debt he'd racked up online. My mother's face went white. My father set down the carving knife. And in the silence that followed, Tyler looked directly at me and said, "Maybe Marcus can help. He's always been good at hiding money." I want you to understand, I had never hidden a cent from anyone. I'd simply never advertised what I had because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. But that one sentence, "Marcus has always been good at hiding money," planted something in my mother's mind that grew roots overnight. Within a week, she was telling relatives I'd been secretly wealthy for years and refusing to help the family. Within 2 weeks, my father was telling people at his Rotary Club that his oldest son had changed and forgotten where he came from. Within a month, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a message asking why I was embarrassing the family by refusing to help Tyler with his debts. Debts I knew nothing about and had nothing to do with. I tried calling my mother to clear it up. She didn't answer. I tried calling my father. He picked up just long enough to say, "We don't need your money, Marcus. We need you to stop pretending you're better than this family," and hung up. That was the last conversation we had for 11 years. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until that letter outside the law office 3 years ago, was that my family hadn't just cut me off emotionally. They had done something far colder, far more deliberate. After I stopped showing up to holidays, after I stopped calling, after the silence calcified into something permanent, my parents began telling people I had died. Not metaphorically, not as some poetic way of saying I'd left the family. Literally. My mother told her church group I had passed away from a sudden illness. My father told his business partners I had died in an accident. They held what I can only describe as a memorial gathering, attended by extended family, neighbours, people who had known me my entire childhood, while I was alive and working 40 miles away, building a company that would eventually be worth more than anything my father had built in 30 years. I found out about the memorial through, of all people, Brianna, Tyler's old girlfriend, the same woman who'd been sitting at that Thanksgiving table the night everything fell apart. We'd stayed loosely in touch over the years. Nothing romantic, just the kind of distant friendliness that survives a breakup between other people. She reached out to me out of the blue, hesitant, almost afraid, and said, "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not hate me for asking it. Are you okay? Like, are you alive?" I laughed at first, thinking it was some strange joke. Then she sent me a photo, a programme from a memorial service, my name printed at the top, in a soft serif font. A photo of me from high school graduation, dates that bookended a life that hadn't actually ended. I sat in my apartment for almost an hour staring at that photo, trying to understand how a family decides their living son is easier to explain as dead than as someone they simply fail to talk to. Here's the part that took me the longest to accept. It wasn't about grief. It wasn't about covering shame. My mother had used my fabricated death to apply for a small life insurance policy my grandfather had set up decades earlier, one that named me as the insured with my parents as beneficiaries, a policy nobody had bothered to update or cancel after I turned 18, because nobody in that family had thought of me as someone worth managing paperwork for. They filed a claim. They needed a death certificate, and getting one without an actual body required exactly the kind of fraud you'd expect. Doctored paperwork, a complicit funeral home contact through a cousin who worked in records, and enough family members willing to look the other way, because the story being told was simpler than the truth. The claim was small in the grand scheme, just under $90,000. But it wasn't about the money for me. It was about what it told me. They hadn't just walked away from me. They had actively decided I was worth more to them dead than alive. I didn't go to the police immediately. I sat with it. I let it become fuel instead of letting it become rage, because rage burns fast, and I needed something that would burn slow and clean. I hired a private investigator named Selena Ruiz, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd spent 15 years doing insurance fraud work before going independent. I told her everything. She didn't blink. She said, "Marcus, if what you're telling me is true, this isn't a family drama anymore. This is federal fraud, insurance fraud, falsified government documents, and depending on who signed what, potentially conspiracy." It took her 4 months to build the paper trail, the fraudulent death certificate. The funeral home employee, my second cousin Patrick, who had falsified the filing in exchange for a loan from my father that was never going to be repaid. The insurance claimed documents with my mother's signature on the beneficiary form. The memorial service programme, which Selina obtained directly from the church, who still had a copy in their records, blissfully unaware that the man being mourned had a verified driver's licence renewal on file with the state of Ohio, dated 4 months after his supposed death. While Selina built the case quietly in the background, I kept living my actual life, the one nobody in my family had bothered to check on. My software company, by then renamed Route Line Logistics, had grown into something none of them could have imagined. We weren't just serving regional truckers anymore. We had contracts with 3 of the largest freight companies in the Midwest. I'd been featured briefly in a trade publication that my family would never have read, because why would they read anything connected to a dead son? That brings me to the letter. 11 years of silence, and then, out of nowhere, a letter from my father. Not an apology. Not an explanation. A letter informing me that my grandmother, the same woman who had once controlled that trust fund, had passed away, and that there was a reading of her will scheduled at a law office downtown, and that my presence was requested, as if I were a colleague being invited to a meeting, rather than a son being summoned back from the dead by people who had buried him on paper. I almost didn't go. Selina told me I should, because by then her investigation was nearly complete, and she said, sometimes the best evidence walks itself into the room. So I went. The law office was the kind of place with leather chairs and a receptionist who offers you coffee in a voice trained never to ask uncomfortable questions. I walked into the conference room, and the silence that followed is something I will never fully be able to describe. My mother's coffee cup actually slipped from her hand and cracked against the table. My father stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. Tyler, sitting beside a woman I didn't recognise, who I'd later learn was his wife, just stared at me like he was trying to do math that refused to add up. "You're supposed to be," my mother started, and then stopped herself because even she understood, somewhere in that frozen second, that finishing the sentence out loud, in front of an attorney and a court reporter who'd been brought in for the will reading, would be its own confession. "Dead," I said, finishing it for her. "Yeah, funny thing about that." The attorney handling the will reading, a calm older man named Walter Brennan, who clearly had no idea what family chaos he'd just stepped into, cleared his throat and asked if everyone needed a moment. My father said no, too quickly, and asked everyone to just proceed with the reading. That's when the first real twist hit, the one I hadn't seen coming even after everything Selina and I had uncovered. My grandmother's will named me, not to Tyler, as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of her estate. Not because she'd forgotten the chaos, because she'd known about it the whole time. It turned out my grandmother, in the final years of her life, had quietly kept tabs on me through an old neighbour of hers who happened to live 2 streets from my Dayton apartment. She'd known I was alive. She'd known about the company. She'd known somehow about the memorial service my parents had held, because she'd refused to attend it, citing a vague illness that everyone simply accepted at the time without question. My grandmother had spent the last 3 years of her life rewriting her will twice, each time cutting my parents and Tyler further out, leaving a letter attached to the will that Walter Brennan read aloud in that conference room, his voice steady even as my mother began crying in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with panic. The letter said in part that my grandmother had always suspected something was deeply wrong in how the family treated me, that she regretted not intervening sooner, and that she hoped whatever I chose to do with what she'd left me would be used to build the kind of life nobody in that family had ever believed I deserved. My father's face had gone the colour of wet paper. My mother wasn't crying anymore. She'd shifted into something colder, calculating, the same expression I remembered from childhood, right before she rewrote a story to make herself the victim of it. "This is insane," she said. "Walter, there has to be some mistake. Marcus hasn't been part of this family in over a decade." "Funny," I said, "because according to a death certificate filed in this county, I haven't been part of anything in 3 years." The room went silent in a way that felt like the air itself had been pulled out of it. Walter Brennan, to his credit, didn't even flinch. He simply looked at my father and said, "Mr. Holloway, is there something you'd like to clarify for the record?" That's when Selina, who I'd asked to wait in the hallway just in case, stepped into the doorway, file folder in hand, and said, "Actually, I think I can help clarify quite a bit." What followed over the next 20 minutes was the kind of public humiliation I'd spent years trying not to fantasize about, because fantasizing about it had always felt too much like becoming someone I didn't want to be. But sitting there, watching it happen in real time, wasn't satisfying in the way revenge is supposed to feel in movies. It was quiet. It was almost sad. Selina laid out, document by document, the falsified death certificate, the insurance claim filed under my name, my second cousin Patrick's signature. On records he had no legal authority to file, my mother's signature on the beneficiary form requesting payouts. My father tried to interrupt twice. Both times Walter Brennan held up a hand and said, "Let her finish." Tyler, of all people, was the one who broke first. He stood up, knocking his chair back, and said, "I didn't know about any of this, I swear. I had no idea they actually filed a death certificate. I thought it was just something Mom said to people to stop the questions about why Marcus wasn't around." "You thought it was just something she said," I repeated, and for the first time in that whole meeting, my voice cracked, not from anger, but from something heavier. "Tyler, you sat at a table for years, while people who love me believed I was dead, and the version of that you're upset about isn't that it happened, it's that you didn't know the paperwork was real." He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Here's where the second twist landed, the one that even Selina hadn't fully prepared me for. While reviewing the insurance documents, she discovered that the policy hadn't just been used once. My mother had attempted to file a second, smaller claim 18 months after the first, this time tied to an old supplemental policy through my father's business that nobody had remembered existed, a policy that would have paid out an additional $31,000. That second claim had been denied, not because anyone caught the fraud, but because of a clerical oversight at the insurance company that flagged my driver's license renewal as an active record. They hadn't been caught by detectives. They'd been caught by bureaucracy, and they'd simply tried again less than 2 years later, fully prepared to commit the same fraud twice. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a single desperate decision made in grief or financial panic. This was a family that had built an entire second narrative of my life because the real one had become inconvenient, and they were willing to keep using it as long as it kept paying out. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I simply looked at my mother and asked the only question that mattered to me in that room. "Did you ever, even once, wonder if it would catch up to you? Or did you just assume I'd stay quiet forever, the way I always did?" She didn't answer. My father did, in a voice that had lost all its old authority. "Marcus, whatever you're planning to do, think about what it would do to this family." "This family," I said, "held a funeral for me and used the death certificate to collect a check. I think you stopped getting to use that word the day you signed it." I want to be clear about what happened next, because the ending of this isn't some fantasy where I burned everything to the ground out of spite. Selina had already, with my approval, forwarded the documentation to the county prosecutor's office and the state insurance fraud division weeks before that will reading, timed deliberately to land right around the moment my family would have no choice but to face it in front of witnesses. My father was charged with conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. My mother was charged as a co-conspirator for falsifying the beneficiary claim. My cousin Patrick, the funeral home employee, lost his job and faced his own separate charges for falsifying government death records, a far more serious offence than he'd apparently understood when he agreed to help as a favour. My father ended up taking a plea deal that kept him out of prison, but left him with a felony record, a suspended business licence, and restitution payments that effectively dismantled the HVAC company he'd spent 30 years building. My mother avoided jail time through a combination of restitution and probation, but the church she'd told her death story to didn't exactly welcome her back with open arms. Once the local paper ran a small story under the headline, "Family Faked Son's Death for Insurance Payout." Small towns talk. That story did more damage to her social standing than any courtroom ever could have. Tyler and I never fully repaired things, but we talk now, carefully, the way two people do when they're rebuilding something neither of them is sure can hold weight again. He apologised, eventually, for the comment that started the whole unravelling that Thanksgiving years earlier. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, but appreciation isn't the same as forgiveness. And I never promised him that. My grandmother's estate, once everything settled, became the seed funding for something I'd wanted to build for years. a non-profit branch of Routeline Logistics that provides free routing software and fuel assistance grants to independent truckers who can't afford commercial software. The same kind of guys I used to watch struggle back when I first started coding that little tool out of frustration at 21. We named it the Constance Fund after her. I think about that Thanksgiving table sometimes, the carved turkey, the china my mother never let anyone touch carelessly, the sentence that ended everything. I think about how easy it would have been for that comment to just dissolve into nothing, the way most family arguments do, forgotten by Christmas. Instead, it became the first domino in a chain that ended with my family discovering exactly how far they were willing to go once they decided I was disposable. People ask me sometimes if I regret not reconciling sooner, not picking up the phone during those 11 years of silence. I don't. Because the version of me who would have picked up that phone is the same version who would have kept signing whatever they told him to sign, kept accepting whatever blame they handed him, kept believing that staying quiet was the price of staying loved. That version of me died a long time before that fake death certificate ever did. The man who walked into that law office wasn't him. My name is Marcus Holloway, and the family who buried me on paper never once stopped to ask if the man they were burying might one day read his own obituary and decide to write the ending himself.